Hello guys, I want to share something today that's been on my heart for a while, and I'm only going to say brief things about it today, but probably could share a lot more and may do in the future. And things are evolving, our culture, the times that we live in are changing, and let's just say that I believe in being someone who is open, someone who investigates what they believe and is open to different interpretations, and is always open to the fact that you may have got something wrong. I think you can hold those two things in a nice little balance. I've got deep conviction, but I still keep an open mind about it, and I'm still open to hearing if someone has a different viewpoint, being authentic about following the truth, and therefore not being scared of your views being wrong. So I've always felt that I held to that position, and I still feel like I do. But I do share this today because I have this feeling, I've seen it myself, even in our movement, the movement I'm part of, International Churches of Christ, where I've seen a large swing in some parts in terms of how we decide on what's right and what's wrong, how we decide on truth. And for me, some of that progressive theology has been massively in line with cultural shifts. So culture today, as we know, has definitely swung to a much more left liberal route than what it would have been in the past. That doesn't necessarily make it wrong, but I would always notice that the Bible, God constantly tells us to avoid becoming like the world around you. You know, it says in James 1:27 that God accepts religion as pure and faultless is to keep yourself from being polluted by the world, also looking after orphans and widows, but watch out for the pollution of the world. So in my view, some of the let's revisit what we do as a church and as a movement can be good, but some of it isn't so good in my view and can swing way too far in line with the culture around it. And I've seen a little bit of that, and just a few areas where I've noticed that myself in my time traveling around our movement in the last couple of years. And I say this today, I suppose partly is to get it out there, to get people thinking about these things. I know that there are people talking about progressive theology already, and also maybe as a bit of a warning where in your church you've maybe seen some of these things, you've seen a bit of a shift in the way the preaching is delivered, in the way things are said, and expectation levels, and things have changed a little bit, and all of a sudden, you know, some of that may be good, but all of a sudden you're feeling a little bit uneasy about that. So some areas that I've noticed where I feel like in the early days of our movement, we had a very clear fixed view on this. Now, does that mean it was all right in the past? Not necessarily at all. But there's been not just a slight shift to the middle, but a shift completely the other way in some of these areas where we've, in my view, thrown the baby out with the bathwater in some of these areas. Just mention them briefly today, but just say them because you may have seen these things yourself. I think one of the areas for me is just even the authority of the Bible. I've seen a lot more in the last year or two people drawing upon authority from other sources in other areas, or claiming that the Bible isn't necessarily, even in our own movement, that the Bible isn't necessarily to be trusted in every area. Or Paul, as the writer of the scriptures, that maybe he was prone to misogyny or something like that, or things that they said couldn't be trusted because they were men. There's a lessening in authority of the scriptures. There's a lack of conviction about an inerrancy of the Bible, and we'll come back to that in a moment. I think the second thing for me is expectation of discipleship. When I joined the church and our movement, I was excited by the fact that I believe there is a standard of discipleship, and I was part of a church where I never seen that. And I'm like, I read the scriptures and this is what I see. This is what it means to be a disciple. Now, it doesn't mean we steamroll in with judgment and critique our fellow disciples every single day about where they're sitting, but at the same time, there's a certain level of expectation of what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And if I never see those things, or I never hear those things, then it's up to each other to, iron sharpening iron, and to point out the truth of what you see in someone, to not say anything. And I didn't join a movement 25 years ago to follow God in order to now see a lukewarmness around me and say nothing. Not to say I've got it all right myself. The third area then I wrote down here really would have been dealing with sin. I feel like this is another area affected by our culture these days, where rightly in some ways we talk a lot about trauma, we talk a lot about past experiences and reasons why you default to this sin, but sin is still sin, and sin still needs to be dealt with, and it still grieves the heart of God. Now, I need to be sympathetic with those who struggle. Bear with those who are weak, the scriptures tell me, but I can't all of a sudden become, lax about sin. And one of the questions I'd ask in dealing with sin is, does your congregation preach about sin? Preach about the fact that we need to avoid it at all costs, that we need to leave it behind us, that we need to go and leave our life of sin, as Jesus said? Do we actually still preach about this? Because I don't hear it as much as I used to. That doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. I try to be balanced in the way I see things, but nonetheless, there's definitely can be too much of a swing to the ways of the world where we become very soft in all these issues. I think the fourth thing I would say here is the one thing I really noticed myself, and whenever the society moves and even some of our church moves to this more progressive slant, theological slant, is that anyone that's got a lot of conviction or certain about anything is met with instant skepticism. It's like if you're doubting everything, you're to be, that doubt is championed, and certainty is, you're to be skeptical of certainty. I don't believe that. I believe every idea should be tested on its own merits. We all have a conviction, even if it is to doubt, you still express it in such a way that you believe that that is right. But I think these days, making judgment calls, it's almost like you can't make a judgment about anything these days in some quarters because that's seen as not the ways of the world. That's not progressive enough. We've got to go with what we believe to be right. And as Romans says, not let what we consider good to be spoken of as evil. Again, just a very quick summary of these things. The only one I've seen that I feel has been thrown out too much is evangelism. When I became a disciple, it meant that I knew I need to speak the truth to my neighbour. I need to reach out and love and care for those around me, because what I'm doing I believe to be right, and everyone needs to be doing that. So therefore I need to reach out. I believe in many quarters of our movement today, this has been thrown out and discarded, and so much so, how often do you hear it preached? If it's still right, it's still right. Maybe it was overemphasized in your view a little bit in the past, then okay, don't overemphasize it, but it still needs to be preached. So again, finding the balance with this, where again, we'll move on to the sixth one. The other one that we've got to watch out for at the minute with the culture we're in is the God of this age. The God of this age is equality. It's not God himself. It's all about, being equitable to everyone. And that is not the God. That is not the God of the Bible that we follow when we preach. The God, it's a different God. It's equality, and justice is preached a lot these days, but it's not necessarily biblical justice. The last one, again, these days I hear an awful lot, even in our own movement, is this idea that there's just many ways to, to follow the truth. I almost see that coming in more and more. Many of the members of our congregations are fuzzy with what does it actually mean to follow the truth. Well, the questions I have for us today are this. Whatever way you're slanting at the moment, if you find yourself being going along with it, one slant or another, is where do you find truth? Where do you get it from? And obviously for me, I believe it comes from the scriptures, a view that God has spoken through his word, and that's where I find truth. And the question I'd ask is, if we feel like we've moved a little bit in some of the areas of things that we used to think, is, well, where did you get the change from? Did it come from reading the Bible? Or did it come from all the things you were hearing around you and seeing around you, and then you went to the scriptures with this new idea in mind, thinking, well, what does the Bible say about this? That doesn't make it wrong. Sometimes I do have a new idea about something and come to the Bible and think, well, what does the Bible say about this? But what I must make sure is that there's the Bible defining what is true for me. The other thing is, if you are saying this and you see what I'm saying, and you also are afraid of the way that this is moving, do you go and listen and speak to those around you to find out where they sit in these areas? So I hope some of that can help us today in terms of where we sit, just exposing some of this. Please let me know what you think about it. Many thanks.